Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Discussing a Murder. This is Jeff Jones, and with me is Dr. Silkman, Big Jeff, Jack, and Kelly. Start at the top and say hello to Dr. Silkman. How you doing today, Dr. Silkman?
I'm going very well, thanks, Jeff, and a big welcome to the panel and a big welcome to everyone in chat. It's great to be here.
Well, thank you for coming. And Big Jeff in transit, how's it going?
Hey, Jeff, thanks for having me back, even in my disabled transiting condition. It's great. It's great to be here. If I could throw out a shout out, I have to say to Dr. Silkman how much I'm enjoying the new Foul Play series, going over the book. I'm listening to the concise first episode, and it's going to take me 3 trips to work to be able to listen to the whole thing. But I'm enjoying it very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
And looking forward to this one. Let's get on to it.
On to the next, Big Jeff. That's right. Well, on to the next to Jack. How you doing, buddy?
Hey, thanks for having me, and hello to everyone in chat, and hello to all the panel. Yep, definitely on to the next. We had a really good episode in conversation on the last one, and looking forward to getting into this even deeper. Let's do it.
Let's do it. Kel, how you doing? How's it going this morning?
Good morning, everyone. It's good to be back. Welcome back, Big Jeff. It's always good to see your, well, I can't see your smiley face this time, but it's great to hear your voice. And hello to everyone in the chat today.
Absolutely. And without any further ado, let's hit it.
When I became Stephen Avery's attorney, it didn't take me very long to realize that I had to buy the same vehicle that Teresa had, because so much of the evidence was concerned with the car. I think the blood stains in the car are probably the biggest piece of evidence against Stephen Avery in the whole case.
How does your DNA get inside of her truck?
My DNA ain't. That's because they got blood out of me. How much blood they got out of me? I'm out of blood.
Steve.
They got a lot of blood out of me. That's sure.
Steve, come back to reality here.
I am.
No, you're not.
I did 18 years. Do you think I want to do any more?
Did you hear what Stephen said? And how much blood they'd gotten out of me? And
Yep.
The truth is, we know. I don't want to hang out any innuendo, guys. I don't want to get off into some out in the weeds theory. I don't. But I have to consider how many years he spent in prison and the various things that he had done at one time or another. And I have to question, again, we know of a lot of blood samples that are recorded as evidence, in one place or another. But I have to wonder, is there something missed? He's not going to remember. I mean, Stephen, he's just not. I feel that in my brain. He's not going to remember every time he got stuck and blood rolled, whatever. So I have to wonder, kind of on the side of my head. Again, I don't mean to get out there in the weeds. Is there a blood vial out there that got lost in the shuffle that somebody got their hands on that was around that time frame? I'm just saying, because I'm thinking to Dr. Silkman's presentation on the blood methylation test, right? So
yeah,
just throwing it out there for conversation.
If you have a look at Stephen's reaction, he is genuinely very surprised and shocked. It doesn't look like he's faking it, right? He really is genuinely shocked. But the only comment I want to make here is that Wiegert said to Stephen, "How does your DNA get inside her truck?" Now, this interview took place on November the 9th. Cherie Cohane didn't search the DNA databases until November the 10th. So therefore, how did Wiegert know anything about Stephen's DNA being inside Teresa Horbach's RAV4? He couldn't have. So either he's lying, because obviously the investigators are permitted to lie and challenge someone, because Culhane didn't know until the day after.
So what I would add to that is that this case is not the story of the mountain of evidence that's there. It's about the mountain of evidence that's not there, that ought to be there to corroborate the evidence that is. That's a mouthful. I dare you guys to say that after having as much wine as I've had. You know, his blood is in the RAV. We even have an idea of how old it is, but there's no mixture, as Dr. Silkman has pointed out many times. The stuff that should be there is not there. So that's what makes us suspicious. Not the fact that his blood is in there, the fact that there's so much stuff all over the place, across the suite of forensic evidence discovered, that's not there. So that's really, to me, the story of this case. That was.
They got a lot of blood on me, sure.
Steve, come back to reality here.
I am.
No, you're not.
I did 18 years. Do you think I want to do any more?
Stephen Avery told investigators during a taped interview that he had never been in Teresa Halbach's vehicle. We now know that's a lie.
That goes to show the power that DNA has, finding DNA or saying that you have found someone's DNA inside the victim's vehicle, right? A statement like that by Pagel is extremely powerful. And you'll see in a minute how Ken Kratz emphasizes that point, that the fact that Stephen Avery has lied. They found his DNA inside the vehicle. That's a very, very powerful argument. Now, for most people listening to this who don't have a background in DNA, who don't understand how easy it is to manipulate and get the desired result you want, they are already assuming that he is guilty. So hence, for a planter, and Kelly has made this point, this excellent point many, many times, that's why you need to place something of your suspect, and in this case, blood and touch DNA, as we'll see in a minute, inside the victim's vehicle, right? That is a very, very powerful association.
Well, Tony, the way that I look at it is going all the way back to 1985. In order to get Stephen Avery off their backs, they needed a whopper. And when you look at what that whopper needed to contain, it needed to contain DNA to sway public opinion. But to Ken Kratz and Jerry Pagel and Manitowoc County's horror, that still didn't sway public opinion sufficiently. And they needed to pile on to this evidence that they have because people still didn't believe it. And what they did was absolutely horrific because it involved the false confession of Brendan. And that was just the horrible addition that they needed to make, finally pushed the skates over the edge. And it was disgusting what they did.
100% correct, Big Jeff, because from the interrogation of Brendan Dassey, we have the hood latch DNA, and we also have item FL. And you're correct, Big Jeff. That's what was needed in the case to tip it in the favor of the state.
Yeah, the way I look at the evidence that the state used against Stephen is like breadcrumbs. If you follow it, it's like a breadcrumb. You've got the RAV, that's breadcrumb number 1, and then you follow that because it leads you to the Avery salvage yard. Then you obviously have the blood in the RAV, which is the breadcrumb that links, like Dr. Silkman said, it's such a powerful link because you've now brought Stephen into Teresa's world. And then you then follow the next breadcrumb, and that was the key in Stephen's trailer. That's the next big powerful thing because it now, not only have you just put Stephen in Teresa's life, you've now put Teresa into Stephen. So, and then obviously the breadcrumb goes on and on and on to item FL, the touch DNA, hood latch. And when you look at it like that, the breadcrumbing, I think to myself, where is the piece of bread at the end of it? What's holding this all together? And I have to agree with Big Jeff here. It goes back to the 1985 side of it because they needed a whopper, and a whopper of something to go, wow, that's just undeniable. And I think that's the basis of the bread that's sitting at the end, which is the murder of Teresa itself. So I know that's a little bit of a stretch of an analogy for me to bring up about breadcrumbs and stuff, but that is honestly how I see it in my head. It all links. Someone was trying to show a story. Now, Kathleen clearly is trying to make it a Denny story that Bobby Dassey planted all this and led the law enforcement to believe that they were the ones picking up the breadcrumbs. And I know that there's people out there a little bit like me that sit kind of on the fence, that I can still happily lean on the fact that I still think there was law enforcement play in this. I find the thought of Bobby planting touch DNA on a hood latch almost ridiculous, but I see why Kathleen's trying to allude to that. And item F, Earl, I'm sorry, but Bobby Dassey, Denny or not, there's no way he put that bullet in there. That bullet
No.
was a subject from the lab and from someone who made that narrative, and that was the law enforcement.
Correct. 100% correct. If I could just quickly add, there's no doubt in my mind that you've got multiple fingers involved in this pie and frame up. Now, Kathleen Zellner is not trying to involve law enforcement nor the crime lab, because she knows that she's going to lose if she tries to bring in other third parties. But we all know, we definitely all know that law enforcement were involved in elements of planting. We know that, but that won't work for Kathleen Zellner, right? And I agree with the panel. You needed a whopper. Now, how much better can you get by saying, hey, look, in 2003, Stephen got exonerated because of DNA. Well, guess what? Now we're going to convict him based on DNA. So, if you accept one argument, the exoneration path, then you have to accept the other path, his conviction. So hence the dilemma and the power of the DNA.
Please correct me and remind me which one actually said it, but I think one of the most earlier statements we hear being said, which I think echoes throughout the entire case, is when you hear, I don't know if it was Pagel or if it was Fallon, but they said basically Stephen Avery was accused of raping, Penny, and okay, maybe he didn't do it, we maybe got it wrong, but he ended up going on to murdering Teresa Halbach. So basically us locking him away we did everyone a favor because he was a criminal anyway. It was sorry, thank you, Big Jeff. It was Herman. So I think that's kind of where it ties in as well, because they, in their minds, the irony of it is that they're showing it again. Like, just a reminder, everyone. Yeah, okay. He likes to bring up the 1985 case that he didn't, rape Penny and we got it wrong, but here's the big whopper. He now allegedly raped and murdered a woman. And we all got prosecuted and backslapped for accusing him of doing it wrongfully before. And now we're right. He has got this capability of doing such things. So, you know what I mean? Like, I think that's the mentality that I think they draw from it, that they don't want to admit that they were wrong. They're focusing on now you can ignore the 1985 case because this is what he has now done. And they really try to cash in on that. It's quite, it's a dog act really, because they take away.
It's devious.
Yeah, it is. It is.
And then you have Michael Griesbach. Now he was involved in the 85 case. And all that getting presented to, they took in 2005 they took it all to the DCI or the DOJ and dumped it in their lap. But Griesbach, he's basically made the statement that we screwed up in 85, but there's no way that they did anything like that in this case. That didn't happen. What? They did it once, but they couldn't do it again. That was kind of the mentality. Yeah.
Correct. And I call it the Nostradamus moment. You know, everyone's smarter after the fact. And I think it was Gundrum who also said exactly the same thing, as in, okay, they got it wrong in 1985, but, you know, maybe it was a good thing that they got it wrong because Teresa Halbach could be alive today. So, in other words, what are they saying? All of us should be locked up because we're all potential criminals? It's completely
But
crazy.
basically,
Yeah, they're trying to correct a wrong by doing another wrong themselves. They can never admit that they stuffed it up the first time around. And now, as Kelly beautifully put it, they're now trying to justify the error that they made in 1985 by saying, see, hadn't that pubic hair come along, he would have still been in prison. Yeah, okay, he was not guilty, but hey, Teresa Halbach would have been alive. So hence, can you see the way they're trying to turn the tables by justifying why their inactivity back in 1985? What they don't say is that Stephen Avery was deliberately targeted by Kacerik and Vogel, knowing full well that there was a viable other suspect in Gregory Allen. What do you think, Jack? You know a lot about that one.
1000% agree, because they knew that, and that absolutely had to terrify them in May of 2005 when it was found out about the cold case in Hennepin County, Minnesota. That had to terrify them. Had that come out, had to.
Yeah, I mean,
This is where,
go
sorry,
ahead, Kel.
Big Jeff, go.
That's actually too much of a pass to say that they ignored Gregory Allen as they targeted Avery. They knew Gregory Allen was a suspect, but they targeted Avery because he needed to go away for running his cousin, deputy sheriff's wife, off the road. That is what 1985 was about. Nothing else. There were no accidents in 1985. There was no accidental overlooking. It was 100% targeting of Stephen Avery. And they were in the precipice of bringing that all up. What were Vogel and Kacerik going to say when they were going to get directly deposed and certain facts are going to get blown right in their face? What was Vogel going to say to, how come you said that Gregory Allen was on parole in Door County when he'd never been in prison? Who did you call to say that? What was Vogel going to say to that direct question? So it's just miraculous. It was a complete, it was unbelievable. I fired up. I apologize.
No, not at all. And I'm quite sure that both Vogel and Kacerik would have consistently said, now, Jack, back me up on this. They would have both said, I don't recall.
Oh my God, yeah. That was Roar's. I'm surprised when they asked him his name, Doc, he didn't say, I don't recall.
He almost did.
They try to distance the 1985 thing by basically saying, if he hadn't been let out, Teresa wouldn't have possibly died. And this is why I get so caught up in, well, then whose story is this? Is this Stephen Avery's story, or is this Teresa Halbach's story? Or who's the middle ground person that's made them intertwine? Because I always ask myself, and I know it's the most stupidest thing to ask myself because there is no answer to it, because I don't know who is responsible for her death. But the ultimate question is, and I think when you kind of break it down, it makes you go, shit. And this is why it fucks with my head. If Teresa never went to the Avery salvage yard that day, would she have still met her demise? Because if the answer is yes, then that means that the killer isn't someone on the Avery salvage yard, because that wouldn't have been part of the journey. If the answer is no, that the Avery salvage yard needed to be part of this narrative, then your killer is someone on that Avery salvage yard. And I get so caught up in that because this is where when Big Jeff goes like the man miracles, I actually really get it, because it's the sliding door moments in this case that you just think, how unbelievable can you get? There is so many moments that things could have went the other way. And it started from the fact that Stephen Avery didn't even have to make that phone call at 8:12 in the morning. What if he just didn't make it? Something got sidetracked. The next thing is, what if she messaged when he rang back at 11 o'clock? What if she declined? What if she said, you know what? Unfortunately, I'm not going to make it there today. So it's these sliding door moments that just do my head in, because what would have been the outcome if we remove Avery Salvagard from her day planner that day of the 31st? And that's why I get so frustrated when I hear them, say, 1985, and they're trying to link it to 2005 and hide behind it. And I think that's so not fair, because you can't see whether her story would have still had the same outcome with the Avery Salvagard or Stephen being in it. Bit of a tongue twister there, but this is what I get myself into when I have these thoughts. You guys can share the pain with me. Thank you.
But yeah, that's a very good point. But that's something that we can never answer. We'll never be able to answer that question.
Exactly.
But here's a bit of a curveball. Would Teresa Halbach have been murdered if Jody Stokowski had been with Stephen that day?
There's a can of worms right there.
Right? And who knew?
I mean, we've always speculated, why didn't, if law enforcement was involved, then why wouldn't they just kill Jody?
Yeah.
Why this innocent woman that has nothing to do with Stephen, right?
Well, put it this way. Who knew that Jody wasn't there?
Well, that's a great point.
Who knew?
Law enforcement.
Law enforcement. I thought it was an obvious answer, but yes, thanks, Big Jeff.
Law enforcement, but also Bobby Dassey knew that Jody wasn't there either, right?
Now,
I'm not insinuating anything, but if you're going to pin it specifically on Stephen, you got to make sure that he doesn't have an alibi, right? And he did have an alibi witness, Brendan Dassey, and that's why they had to persist in nabbing Brendan. Because if Brendan kept on saying, "Hey, I went to my uncle. Yeah, we burnt a few things, but then I went home. I never saw Teresa. I never saw her vehicle." And they kept on telling him, "You're lying, you're lying, you're lying." Brendan was Stephen's direct alibi. Now, if Jody had been there, would have the outcome had been different, or would they have accused Jody of lying for Stephen? You see what I'm trying to say? If they did it to Brendan, how do you know they wouldn't have done it for Jody? So
they did it in 1985 case with 16 witnesses.
16 witnesses, correct.
I don't know if that Jody would have affected anything, because like you said, if 16 witnesses in 1985 and a receipt from a gas station didn't prove his whereabouts, I don't think at this stage they gave a shit who was the witness and who wasn't. If they could,
because
Stephen Avery's the man they needed.
Correct, because what did Kacerik and Vogel say? They are family members. They're going to stick up for Stephen, right? So therefore, he's in a lose-lose situation. But it was worse for him because he was with Brendan. And Brendan, as you know, was very, very easily coerced and manipulated.
On the key, and Mr. Avery's blood is found inside of Teresa Halbach's vehicle. It is no longer a question, at least in my mind, as the special prosecutor in this case, who is responsible for the death of Teresa Halbach.
To have your blood in the car, it's huge. And so I wanted to spend a lot of time on it, and I wanted to do a bunch of experiments. I've consulted with Stuart James. He's a very well-known blood stain pattern expert. I've sent him all the photographs to analyze. Now, this stain is supposed to have come from Stephen's finger, from that cut, okay? So the person would have to have swiped that middle finger across this area of...
Well, if you got some of the blood drained down or flowed down to the finger, then that would be the object. It would not necessarily be the cut itself.
Mhm.
You see what I'm saying?
Right, because it could have run down to the tip of his finger, say.
Because if the cut was actively bleeding, and you touch that, you're going to see, I believe, a higher volume. It would get maybe some little flow pattern coming down.
Concentrate it to the tip and then wipe it across. However, was there any blood on the keys itself, the key that was recovered?
There was no detectable blood on the key.
And nothing on the key. What about the steering?
This is where we run into a lot of problems, right? And that is that Stephen Avery is actively bleeding. So if he's actively bleeding, he's losing blood from the cut, right? And he's obviously cannot control it. So therefore, these two guys are asking, these two experts are asking, well, if he's actively bleeding from his finger, then one would expect there to be blood droplets absolutely everywhere, right? What you find in the RAV is that the blood is only on selective spots, right? Which tends to indicate that Stephen couldn't have been actively bleeding. He was selectively actively bleeding, which made no sense, right? So if you're bleeding, right, and you've left the blood near the ignition switch, I think it's pretty obvious to think that because you're driving the RAV4, you would have or leave blood on the gear shift, on the handbrake, on the steering column, right? In a lot of multiple places, and including the key, because you've got to grip the key in order to turn over the ignition. And what you're finding is you don't find the presence of blood in any of those areas.
You're very right, Dr. Silkman, but this is where the state also thought one step ahead, because that's why we see them change their narrative. They never alleged that Stephen was bleeding while he drove. They changed it to that when the car was basically stationary, and that I think this is where one of 7 maybe times that Brennan changed his version of the blood, or what the order of their movement of the RAV is, that he cut himself while they were putting the shit around the RAV. So that's why Ken was alluding to the fact that, no, you're not going to see it on the steering wheel. No, you're not going to see it on the gear shaft, because it was a stationary. It was when they had already parked it and they started putting the branches and the scrub around it when they were trying to hide it. That's when Mr. Avery cut open his finger again. So I think as the journey went along, the state was realizing very quickly that these were the issues that they were going to have to make sure that they even answered, because this is the potential questions that would leave reasonable doubt. At the end of the day, at this stage, what we're going through now, that's all wavered, because the jury had already found Stephen Avery guilty on what they did here in the trial. So obviously, as hindsight, we're looking at it, we can identify these really contradictive things, but at the time of the trial, I don't know whether it was explored enough or whether it just wasn't enough, even if it was, because ultimately he was still found guilty on all these problems that we're seeing.
You know, I see in this hindsight, as Doc said, you know, it's always 2020, and I look at the issues with the crime lab itself, and in particular, you know, Culhane was heavily involved herself, and there are others that are in that crime lab too. I have bigger issues and bigger questions. Again, I'm not trying to put out, you know, a bunch of rabbit holes that we can never find our way completely out of. At the same time, I have to question, as Doc said, these odd areas where the blood wasn't, that you would, the reasonable person, you know, go back, and I quote this a lot today because I think it's something that I myself have tried to do. I know Big Jeff, and, you know, I think everybody here tries to do, being the reasonable person. And I think about somebody with a cut that's busted open or whatever the fact, and they're bleeding in these really strange places that blood is not found nowhere. And especially, you know, that's been, you know, this whole big deal about Avery going under the hood was made, but there's no blood there. There's nothing, and no fingerprints. That even adds a little bit more to like, well, how the hell did he bleed? Well, I guess there's a couple of ways that could have potentially happened. But then now we have to speculate, and the state didn't do that. Did he have gloves, some kind of cloth glove on that, it dripped out of just in certain places, but it protected his fingerprint? There's so many things, but I have real doubts and questions. This goes back to the Disturbed Earth search warrant that Christina got. I have real issues with the crime lab. The blunt and bloody instrument disappeared. And I know I'm getting a little off track. I'm just saying this to connect the dots here and why I have real problems with their integrity. That's just me. That's just an opinion.
Just to echo what Kelly said, Brendan Dassey gave 7 different versions of how Stephen had cut open his finger, right? And I think it's an incredible admission by Kratz. Even he realized that Stephen Avery bleeding while driving the vehicle made no sense at all. So Ken Kratz had to admit that that narrative didn't work at all, right? So now if he cut open his finger while they were putting things around the RAV, what you don't find is any drops of blood anywhere outside the RAV, right? That's the counter argument against that. There's no blood, right? So the whole narrative of how Stephen Avery's blood got placed inside the RAV points to me that it was planted, that someone went in with either some type of vial or pipette or whatever, some type of instrument and dripped it in, because that's what it looks like. It doesn't make any sense that Stephen was driving the RAV while actively bleeding, because you would have expected to find it all over the place. And to prove it, have a look at what happened in his Pontiac Grand Dam, right? There are driplets of blood everywhere in that Pontiac Grand Dam, and also on the gear shift lever. That's exactly what you would expect if someone was driving the vehicle that was actively bleeding. The RAV4 does not resemble that at all.
Agree. And I think you make a great point. Listen, we all know that I've done quite a lot of extensive kind of experiments trying to do this and recreate even as close as I can to what we see. And I'm able to do it. You are absolutely able to control that pattern. I think a lot of people, and it's always in the community, and it's the most logical thought, is why don't we see smudging from fingers? A bleeding finger, you would automatically have blood on your hands. If you're touching things, clearly he's not wiping as he's going, because otherwise he would have wiped away. So it contradicts where the state want you to think that he's bleeding in some areas, but yet he's not leaving bloody fingerprints behind. And if it's not bloody fingerprints at best, it's smudging. There's no smudging. If you're wiping your finger or you're flicking your finger or whatever you're trying to do to stop the bleeding, even putting it in your mouth, whatever it is that the state are alleging that he was able to drip in these certain locations, but then not leave, like I think Big Jeff said in the last episode, is what we don't have. It's the evidence we don't have, and we don't have the natural patterns of someone who has blood on their hands, literally. So it's little things like that, I think, that makes the case. I'm getting excited when we get to, again, like Jack's just said, I'm getting a little bit off track here, but when we get to the swabbing, I think when we get part of the swabbing, I will produce, finally, you guys, I want you guys to see my swabbing from what I took and show you guys what it looks like after 3 days to 6 days anyway, we'll get to it when we get to it. But again, I just think that when I look at the blood in the RAV, it's selective, but in the selectiveness of it, I actually see a narrative. And I've always said that, like, I think the blood near the ignition is trying to connect that he would have had to have had the key. It's the connection of the key, and then we find the key in the trailer. I think the blood in the back on the panel, the passenger panel, was basically to say he was responsible for having to put the seats down because he was the one that put her body in the back for the few seconds that Brendan alleged that they had her in there because they were going to drive her and dispose of her elsewhere. And yeah, there's the little things about the blood that I think that someone wasn't just putting it in there just to do it. They were trying to make connections, and they were just, it worked to a degree, but I think that it's puzzling because it's still loose. It's a loose connection, and it can be open for interpretation, but I've said all this before, so let's carry on.
So I guess the questions that I have is, when you look at the picture of maybe you can back it up to where they show the picture of the blood stain. The thing that we've always said looks like Q-tips is that where they swabbed it, or was that the pattern that was there? I'm actually surprised that we're not hearing Zellner's experts talk about the fact that we really don't have an in situ picture of the unswabbed ignition, situation.
Yep.
And why not? And does the lack of having that, if that is indeed the if those things that look like seagull wings are indeed from the swabbing and not from the natural flow, how come they're not saying, this picture is so spoiled, or the situation's so spoiled, I can't make heads or tails out of it, and it's because we don't have that picture, and we should be complaining about that. So that's what's always baffled me about this part.
You're correct, Big Jeff. There's no way that's an in situ picture. So what obviously has happened is that when Groffy first went into the RAV, remember he was there the day after, he actually admitted doing a swab of that blood stain, right? He did a presumptive test of that blood stain. And to make matters even worse, Culhane then admitted doing 2 swabs, extra swabs of that blood stain. She did a presumptive test to prove that it was blood, and then she did another swab in order to get a sample of blood to prepare genomic DNA from. That means that ignition area has been swabbed 3 times, not once, not twice, but 3 times. Every time you put a solution on a swab, you dilute the sample out. So normally what happens when you use a swab, you swipe it, right, in order to get the blood onto the swab. And you can clearly see on the distribution pattern that it's been diluted and forced up, which begs the question, why didn't they do an in situ picture? In other words, why didn't they take a photograph first and then do the swabbing? I've got no answer.
Well, just to kind of bounce off that, did anyone even check Groffy's credentials? Because is there even a reason why he was taking presumptive tests to begin with? He was a forensic photographer. I don't see anywhere where he had the skills or the permission to be able to conduct testing.
He was told to do it. He was told to do it by his boss.
Right. Was that Harrington? Like, because I know he mentions Harrington.
No, it wasn't Harrington. I can't think of her name. I'll look it up. I'll find it for you.
Correct. All he should have done was walk around the vehicle and take photographs. It's Culhane that takes the swabs, right? Not Groffy. So it's rather interesting. Why would Groffy take a swab of the ignition? Why? Why would he do a presumptive test? It makes no sense. You will take photographs, in situ photographs, then you get Culhane to come in and take all the swabs and do the presumptive test. Because Culhane said, we look at stains, we do a presumptive test to prove that it's blood. If it comes back negative, we don't take a sample for DNA. If it comes back positive, we take an additional swab and prepare genomic DNA from it. So what on earth is Groffy doing a presumptive test on that stain near
Certainly
the
sounds.
ignition? Don't you?
It sounds
Yeah,
like.
don't.
I'm sorry. It sounds like when you said this word, doctor, and you said diluted, when you said the more people that are in there swabbing, you dilute the sample, right?
Correct.
And that's all I can see when I hear this is that, well, have him do it. He'll sample it. And then Culhane can sample it a couple times. And pretty soon, guess what? There's no sample left. Sorry, that's
Correct.
just how I see it.
And I know that a lot of guilters were saying, "Oh, look at that! That looks just like Stephen Avery's finger if he had put his finger directly onto that area there." Right? They're trying to match it to his cut, but that doesn't make any sense at all, right? Because Kathleen, as we'll see, Kathleen Zellner actually tried turning one of her staff tried to turn the ignition with a bleeding finger and could never reach that particular area because it was something like about 2 inches apart. So that little spot, and I agree with Kelly, it's there to tell a story, as in it's near the ignition switch. That means that Stephen Avery was there in the driver's seat, turning the ignition and driving the RAV. Although they snookered themselves, because if he was driving the RAV, as Kelly pointed out, where's the blood on the gear shift? The handbrake, around the area there, you don't find any of that. That's actually quite revealing.
I know this is totally outside the box, and I probably put way too much thought into it than I should have, but I also found it really weird that they put like a 24-hour gap between the RAV going into the crime lab and before Sherry Culhane enters the RAV and the narrative to start doing testing. She doesn't come until, I believe, like the 8th. And I've always found that weird because, you know, if Groffy has presumptively tested the blood in the RAV and he is confident that it's blood, why are they waiting an extra day to start doing the testing? They wait for her for an entire day before they bring her in. And when I first started this case, I used to think, oh, they want to put a distance between her because ultimately they didn't want to create a narrative where a defense team could say, hey, we've got the woman that was asked to put her in the trailer or the garage, and she's so close around the blood. I think they always knew that the blood in the RAV was going to be the big make their case. So they wanted to eliminate anything that could be accused of tampering. And I think that's why when we go back to the RAV, for example, on the salvage yard with the tarp over it, a lot of people for a long time believed that that's when the blood was planted in there, that they were doing it under the cover of these tarps. And again, and they're like, no, the car was locked. And people have always thought, is that why they needed this RAV to be locked, to eliminate the fact that they were going to be accused of having all these opportunities to do it? So again, I always overthought that Sherry Culhane thing. I just thought with such a movement in the case, if you're finding out that there is blood in the car, why would you wait for the forensics scientist or the lab technician to come in and start automatically doing her job and getting to the bottom of where they're meant to go with it? But to wait, it's bizarre for me anyway.
Yeah, but not only that, and Jack will back me up. When Groffy went there to examine the RAV4, Jack, what did he find on the driver's side door? What did he find?
It was unlocked.
It was unlocked. Correct, it was unlocked.
Right. It hasn't, I think probably the preeminent RAV researcher is Henberry, right? And hasn't he come to the conclusion that you weren't moving that car without getting into it, dropping the drive shaft or not, the wheels wouldn't have turned?
That's right.
You needed to get in that car. So, if you want to talk about the new evidence, there's that. Henberry's done the research. You're not moving that car without getting into it, and there's your opportunity. So, and the fact that they forgot to lock it, Graffi finds it unlocked. What does that tell you? You know, the state's control over the evidence is lost.
And that makes a complete mockery of why they would leave the RAV4 on the property for hours and hours and hours and not open up a door and start immediately processing what's in that RAV4, right? Because there you've got the vehicle in situ. It wasn't raining. All they had to do was call a locksmith to open the door under supervision, under a tarp, and start processing that vehicle, right? And therefore you take photos, in situ photos of that vehicle then and there. And then you've got no arguments, no dispute. But the way they carried it out by placing a tarp on top, right? You could easily go underneath the tarp. No one can see what you're doing. And then for Fassbender to wait until it started pouring down with rain and then he removed the tarp is a number one no-no, right? Because it rained and a lot of potential forensic evidence got washed away. Now, how ridiculous is that?
The question is, how did that rain affect A23?
Correct. But not only that, there was a little bit of A23 left over. But think about it. If there were other spots of blood on that RAV4 left by the person who left A23, could have provided clues of, you know, who was touching that RAV and where, right? The fact that it downpoured with rain and them trying to put the vehicle in that trailer, it's unforgivable. And how stupid. They spent hours looking at that RAV, not touching it, and then when they moved it, it downpoured. That's crazy.
And just to echo what you said, though, it's a very fair statement. Why didn't they just obviously do it while they were on the site, everything in situ? And they can't say anything about a locksmith because we have a report. It was ultimately alleged that a locksmith was the one that came in before Graffi got there and opened the door for them. There is actually a report that shows that, well, not from the locksmith himself, but from Harrington writes a report, I think in DCI, and says, you know, we had a locksmith come out before Graffi came in early in the morning, open up one side of the door for us, and that's how we started this investigation in the lab. So why couldn't they have done that at the salvage yard? It doesn't change what they did ultimately anyway. It just would have been more authentic doing it again on the salvage yard in situ.
Correct. They did everything backwards, and that's what doesn't make any sense. And they have a right. Researchers have a right to be critical of the way the RAV4 was processed. All the criticism was brought about by themselves. You can't blame truthers for being harsh and critical because the processing of that RAV is ridiculous. Like if they find a body, right? Someone is deceased, they process that person then and there. They're not going to say, oh, let's remove that person, take him to the morgue and we'll process the body there. No, because you destroy potentially important forensic evidence. The best place to have processed that RAV was right there. Put a tarp on top of it. Bring it into one of the garages, right? Law enforcement had a jurisdiction, they had control. So no one was going to cause any form of interruption. You process it there, you open it up, you take swabs, you look for fingerprints, take photographs, you do it all in situ. No one's going to question that. But the way they processed the RAV, they drew that criticism to them.
This area of...
Well, if you got some of the blood drained down or flowed down to the finger, then that would be the object. It would not necessarily be the cut itself.
Mhm.
You see what I'm saying?
Right, because it could have run down to the tip of his finger, say.
Because if the cut was actively bleeding, and you touch that, you're going to see, I believe, a higher volume. It would get maybe some little flow pattern coming down.
Concentrate it to the tip and then wipe it across. However, was there any blood on the keys itself, the key that was recovered?
There was no detectable blood on the key.
And nothing on the key. What about the steering wheel?
No blood on the steering wheel.
That's,
No blood on the door handle getting into the car.
well, how can it be said, like, I think I read it in some testimony, that that would be consistent with an active source of bleeding, that little stain? And yet there's no blood on the steering wheel and no blood on the exterior door handle.
The gear shift level, after you put
Oh,
the key in and start it, you would have to.
Yeah, what about the gear shift level?
The
Any-
gear
No
shift
blood
right there.
on the gear shift.
It doesn't make any sense that it's an active source of
Yeah.
bleeding.
Mr. Avery's blood is in 6 different places in this vehicle. Other DNA that is without blood being visible is in yet another. That would be the hood latch. We heard some questions of some law enforcement officers about planting evidence. We didn't hear anything about how an officer might plant a stain like this, what's called a contact stain.
That's a misrepresentation right there, isn't it? He's saying that Stephen Avery would have left a mark like that. But we've kind of talked about this at length, that what you're seeing is someone taking a sample from this. You're not seeing the stain. You're seeing what it looks like after 3 samples have been taken off of this column.
That's what most of us feel. I mean, to me, that they created that gull-wing pattern using the Q-tips and rolling it forward. Now, I'm not a lab person, so unlike Big Jeff, you get what you pay for. I just, if you zoom in on it, I mean, clearly, that's exactly what it looked like to me, being the reasonable person, not reading anything more into it.
Yeah, what Mr. Kratz was trying to do was he was trying to put forward the argument that the stain that you saw there was a direct result of Stephen Avery's cut finger directly contacting that area there. So he was trying to pattern match the cut on Stephen's finger to what you see on that near the steering wheel. And that clearly isn't the case, because if you have a look at high resolution images, you can clearly see that there are patterns involving a Q-tip touching the blood spot and being pushed up. That's why you get that gull pattern. So if you take a Q-tip and you put a solution on it, the moment you touch a blood spot, you immediately start to dilute it. And as you force the sample up, you're going to smear it, right? And Kelly will tell you, she's done a lot of those type of experiments. You add a solution to that blood, you're going to now start to agitate that blood spot. And if you put a bit of force to take up a sample of the blood in order to do a presumptive test, and also if you're going to take a sample of blood to prepare genomic DNA, you have to almost like take a scraping, right? Otherwise, you're not going to pick up any sample at all. So that there is definitely not an in situ image.
Just one more thing before Kel, I just have a brief comment. This goes into the events that happened on the 5th. Well, it would have been late on the 5th after it got to the crime lab, and the 6th. And I always reference back to the Harrington Fassbender phone call and what information actually was, what did he actually tell him and what actually made it into the report? Because by this time, Groppe had been there or was there. I don't, it's unclear which, but, or maybe he was coming. I'm sorry. I don't think he arrived until the 7th. I might have to look at the dates, but regardless of the fact, this all centers around events of the 6th that I'm so untrusting of. I hate that, but that's where I stand.
I believe that Groppe was there on the 6th Culhane came the day after on the 7th. So
Yes.
therefore he got to the lab. He got to I believe the RAV4 got there about 1 o'clock in the morning or 2 o'clock in the morning.
Something like that, yeah.
It was sort of like a 4-hour trip or something like that. It took a long time to get to the lab. They must have then called the locksmith to unlock the RAV, because Groffy, when he came in and he took a sample, the door was open. The driver's side door was open. And here's the kicker, right? Why then would the crime lab make a duplicate key to get inside the RAV4 when it was already opened?
Which common sense would tell you requires active bleeding. And Mr. Stalkey testified that upon his opinion as a blood spatter expert, and does this for a living, that this particular stain by the ignition is absolutely consistent with somebody with a cut to the outside of the right hand and turning an ignition. This contact transfer stain was absolutely consistent.
Given the location of these 6 areas.
Sorry, Jeff, that's exactly what Kratz is alluding to, that Stephen was bleeding from his cut, and that cut directly touched that area there. That's bullshit, because that's not what it looks like. I think a researcher worked out that Stephen had to actually be standing upside down in order to get that pattern formed with his finger. So it made absolutely no sense at all. What he didn't tell you was that blood spot had been swabbed 3 times, once by Groffy and twice by Culhane. So, the jury's hearing all this thinking, bloody hell, maybe Stephen did touch that area there. And that's why ultimately it's a real tragedy that Stephen didn't have, as part of his defense team, a blood spatter expert to counteract that.
You actually have to delve into what the word consistent means, right? Your experts say, well, this is consistent with. It means that, if somebody had a bloody finger, then maybe they could have left a mark like that. That doesn't mean that, that this is as definitive as a fingerprint because of the location of where Stephen's cut was. It was unquestionably him. It's it's an interpretation of a word, and consistent isn't even necessarily that strong of a word, right? Definitive, if they use the word, oh, this is definitively him, because where that mark was, there's only one way that mark could have been made, and that was if he was, that there are much more certain words in the English language than consistent, right? And that's something that you have to. Watch out when Ken Kratz starts talking, because when he's lying as soon as his lips start to move, right? He's using a terminology that an expert uses that is not necessarily definitive and asserting that it is. So just watch out for the language he uses.
100% agree. And if I could just make the comment, and Jack will back me up on this. Remember when they asked Penny Bernstein whether she was certain that it was Stephen Avery that had attacked her? And she goes, well, I think I'm about 90% certain. And
absolutely.
And Vogel said, no, you got to be 100% certain. And that's right. Exactly what Kratz was trying to allude to here. He's not giving any options, right, Jack? He's saying, no. This indicates that Stephen finger touched that area there. He wanted 100% certainty. He didn't want 90, 95. He wanted it to be 100%.
It's a reminder of that odontologist, that Dr. West. He always signed his damn letters indeed and without doubt. Son of a bitch.
Correct.
That's another break your iPad guy right there.
And he was indeed and without doubt 100% wrong.
He sure was.
I kind of had a brain fart earlier and I forgot to mention it, but I kind of want to go back to that locksmith thing and just throw this out there. What does a crime lab need with a locksmith? Are you telling me that a crime lab can't get into a car?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. You know, this was pointed out by Harrington in his phone call to Fassbender that he included in that report. I want to say it's DCI report one. I don't know. I want to say it wrong. I'll have to look it up. But nonetheless, he included it in his report that Harrington told him that he had to call a locksmith. So what did the locksmiths come and do? Yeah, there's a way that, you know, they can get the numbers, but it's difficult to get the code because that comes from correct me here, Doc, the inside lock on the passenger front side.
100% correct. 100% correct. I actually downloaded the manual for the 99 Toyota RAV4, that exact one. And in order to make a duplicate key, you actually have to disassemble the passenger side door, take the lock out, and the lock has got a code which has to be used in order to make a duplicate key. I don't believe you can just give the VIN number. If you could, why in the hell would that manual contain this detailed method of doing a duplicate key? You have to literally disassemble the passenger side door, take out the lock barrel, and on the lock barrel, there's a code that you must provide a locksmith in order to cut a key that fits that RAV. I actually downloaded the manual in order to do it. So they would have got the locksmith to come out with a Slim Jim, and it would have taken him not even a minute to jimmy open that door. Now, are you trying to tell me that with all those law enforcement officers, not one of them knows how to open a door?
That's what I'm saying. I mean, we used to used to call the police. They stopped doing that I think in the 90s actually. But that's who used to unlock your car if you had a problem. They all carried a Slim Jim. And I'm willing to bet some of them still do. So this is why it's so baffling to me that what do you need this locksmith unless you're trying to buy time? I'm sorry, that's just my other idea.
There's one other option, but again, this is on the periphery, guys. This is out there. I don't believe this happened at all. I'm just going to add it to the conversation, just so we're fair. When you buy, a new vehicle, and I know for a Toyota per se, because I had a brand new 2001 Tundra, and with that, with your paperwork, you get the code. They give you, they're like little tab things that you can. It's not like just a slip of paper. It's like something that's more substantial than that, and it's got that code on it. So, and I'm doubting that they had that because the car that Teresa bought I'm pretty sure was a fleet vehicle. I don't think she got any of that when she bought it from Lemieux Toyota. I highly doubt it. So a phone call. I'm just saying that the potential, if her family, had her paperwork, I'm sure they had access to her stuff. They made a call, but that's not mentioned anywhere. So I think what Doc is saying is right. They couldn't get inside, so they called a locksmith out, and he said, "Hey guys, Slim Jim time."
Correct. And you're not going to be able to call a Toyota dealership at 2:00 in the morning to say, "Oh, can you give me the code to this particular vehicle?"
No, absolutely not.
That doesn't make any sense. Whereas calling out a locksmith, it's 24/7 emergency. It would have taken the locksmith a couple of minutes to use a Slim Jim to jimmy open the door. No big deal.
Including the CD case, the two seats, the flakes in front of the seat, and on the area adjacent to the ignition, and then the rear one. Given these separate locations, it's inexplicable how an actively bleeding person could go about and produce all these in that way. Selective
depositing
placement.
of
What you're saying
blood.
is the dots aren't connected.
The dots are far from connected.
The dots
They're in
The
different
blood
books,
dots should
actually.
be connected. So his hands are extremely similar to Stephen. So we've got the cut right here. Yeah, same thickness, same.
Right.
Yeah, not like your hands. Your hands don't match his at all. So what I want to do
Sorry,
is drip, just have some blood right there.
All right. And where was the cut on the inside?
It's right here on the first joint. It's right there.
Do you guys notice something though?
Okay.
I just want you guys to remember this doesn't mean too much, but it's just something to highlight that he's taking blood from a vial and it's all purple tops. She does a lot of her experiments with EDTA blood back in this time of the investigation. I think this is when she was still trying to bring in that theory that maybe the vial was still connected, because you see a lot of all her experiments are done with purple top EDTA. So just keep that in mind in terms of as we go along.
That's true, but it also gives her the ability to carry vials of blood that's not going to coagulate. And so, in fairness, what she's trying to do is to represent, if you're actively bleeding, right, you're not going to immediately clot. So as you can see, she's adding the blood and the person is touching the various objects immediately as though you're actively bleeding fresh blood, as opposed to blood that's going to coagulate, if you know what I mean. So carrying those purple top vials just gives flexibility.
Yeah, it sure does. I just wanted to show though that when she's doing experiments, this is her primary blood that she's using. She's not having people just constantly putting a pick in their arm and they're She does that once. She does it for the blood sync theory. She does it as she does alternative. She does it as EDTA vial blood, and she has one of her paralegal consultants give fresh blood on the spot.
Correct.
But they don't show you that. But I just wanted to show that, yeah, you're right. They're using the vial blood because it's the most logical thing to do. You don't want coagulation. You want to be able to do experiments, but her primary usage is EDTA blood. And it just kind of shows how flexible EDTA blood is, though, how you can work with it, because it has that, you have time to play with it, you have time to use it. You couldn't do this with fresh blood, like you said. You have to be very quick. It coagulates quicker, fresh blood. So it just kind of gives people a bit of an understanding why she is using EDTA blood, and that's because it's flexible. You can play around.
It gives you time.
I just wanted to add, I did find an answer to our question earlier about graphy. Can I read this, or you want me to wait?
Go for it.
Absolutely.
Okay. Graphy is under cross-examination, and the question's asked, okay, and then a decision was made with you and your supervisor, Lucy Meyer, that's M-E-I-E-R, not to process the Toyota anymore that day, and that you would instead wait until the morning when the forensic DNA analyst and other types of people would be normally working. Is that right? Answer, correct. Question, and okay, the photographs that you displayed, though, you still have those up in front of you? Answer, which one are you referring to, sir? Question, all the ones that you introduced? Answer, yes, I do. Question, on direct, okay, with the exception of the ones of the Pontiac Grand Dam, I'm not directing your attention to those right now at all. But with respect to the RAV4 pictures, do you know, were all those taken on November 6th, or were some of them also taken on the 8th? And if so, do you know which ones were on the 6th and which ones were on the 8th? That's my question. He takes a moment, but nonetheless, the name of the, I'm not going to read through all that. Nonetheless, the name of his supervisor that told him to take that sample is Lucy Meyer.
Interesting. Very good, Jack. I appreciate that. Wrapping that into a little bow and getting that factually correct for us. And I think it's that time where we have to wrap this episode up into a little bow. And when we do that, there's only one man that I can think of, and that's Big Jeff. Big Jeff, if you're there, lead off the wrap up.
I'm here. Yeah, I apologize. I had a few connectivity issues as we were going along. This episode is really just the beginning of Kathleen Zellner's forensic analysis. Starting with what she deems as the most damning piece of evidence against Stephen Avery, and there's no question that she's right. It's the it's the blood of the RAV. You couldn't be a legitimate Avery supporter unless you had serious questions about the quality, of that evidence from the state's perspective. And there's just, gigantic holes all over it, starting with the fact that we don't have an in situ picture of it. They had to dilute it 3 times before they took a picture of it for everybody to see. It's questionable, right? We know that the state needed a whopper to get past 1985. That whopper needed to include DNA. So it's not surprising that they had some DNA against Stephen. And I think you saw the panel very adequately, pick it apart. There is reasonable doubt that blood, that there's not any doubt, I think, that it's Stephen Avery's. Maybe some minimal doubt, but I think most people believe that it is. But the fact that it was not deposited by his actively bleeding finger, I don't think that us on the panel believe that. Well, anyway, that's a little bit much, but thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Jeff. Appreciate those comments, and I'm right there along there with you. Why don't we head to the top of the row and ask Dr. Silkman for his wrap-up comments.
Yeah, that was a really excellent series of comments by Big Jeff, and I really enjoyed this episode a real lot. My area of interest, of course, is the forensics. Having a background in DNA, I'm very interested in this aspect of the case. But something that, really I just can't comprehend, right? They never were in a rush. The investigators were never in a rush while that RAV4 was sitting there at the Avery salvage yard for hours. And all of a sudden, they're now in a rush to process a blood sample in the RAV4 by Groffy. Isn't that interesting? They couldn't wait one more day to have the proper forensic investigation where the crime lab people come in, do their photographs, take their swabs. No, they took one sample, right? They had to do a presumptive test then and there and then stop. Very interesting. And I'm glad that Jack 61 read that out by Groffy. That was really good. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Silkman. And speaking of Jack, he will appear.
Yeah, this is a really interesting aspect of the case, and it's very polarizing as well for all of us, as we know. I'm really interested in, in Dr. Silkman's thoughts, Big Jeff and Kel. They're more technical minded than I am. I mean, I can understand, they can explain it in terms that are easily understood. But one of my really main interests is the mechanics of how did this happen, and trying to put together how these stains appeared in the RAV. I question the integrity of that lab. I know that's harsh. I know that's, me kind of being a bastard here, sitting here at my computer and talking about people way over there, what they did. But I do that, this from an integrity level based on other things. It's not just one thing. So from that aspect of it, I really question, especially the pattern around I question the blood being in there at all, number one. But this pattern of the blood beside the ignition, it's really, to me, it was created by them and then photographed. And that's just how it appears. I just do not believe Stephen Avery was gloved, ungloved, or whatever. Kel pointed out something really fantastic that people need to remember. If he was gloved, why wasn't there a smudge? If he was ungloved, why isn't there some kind of, even if it wasn't his fingerprint, a skin smudge? The key. He had to handle that key, and it had that fiberish, whatever that material is, of the fob. No freaking blood on it. Anyway, thanks for everybody that's joined us. And that's all I got today for now. On to the next. Well, on to Kel.
Thank you, Jack. Yeah, on to the next and on to Kel. Kel, wrap it up for us in a nice, neat bow, if you would. Probably not.
No. I think, again, we're scratching the surface of the blood in the RAV, which we've talked about numerous times. I think at this stage, all I'm confident at is Stephen Avery didn't bleed in it. That's all I basically got. I don't know who put the blood there. I don't know when the blood got put there. I don't know. I want to say I know why, because regardless whether you believe it was the lab itself, law enforcement, or at this stage Bobby Dassey, there was only one motive, and that's to hurt Stephen Avery. But ultimately, the only thing I can say in terms of what we're watching this episode to me ending it is Stephen Avery, in my opinion, as of right now, and it's been like this since I started this case, he's not responsible for bleeding in that RAV. It's just, that's it. That's all I've got.
Absolutely. We'll have to leave it there this week, but I want to say thank you to everyone in chat, and thank you to all the subscribers out there. Today was the day that we crossed over the threshold of 500 subscribers, so that's a really exciting thing for the podcast, and we look forward to crossing over the 1,000 mark someday, hopefully soon. And so don't forget to like and subscribe. It's the cheapest and most effective way to support the channel. And for Dr. Silkman, Jack, Kelly, and Big Jeff, this is Jeff Jones saying this has been Discussing a Murderer.